A model for understanding the nature of knowledge creation through arts research. Embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. Ellen McMahon, Professor, School of Art, Associate Dean for Research, College of Fine Arts, and Lynda Zwinger, PhD, Professor of Literature, University of Arizona, Tucson, Arizona. From the virulent cries of outrage swirling around the 1913 Armory Show, to the current fad of banning books and statues in various areas of the U.S., the public, the intended audience for art, has demonstrated an understanding that art intervenes in actual lives, sensibilities, and behaviors. In the 18th century, preachers and essayists fulminated against the perils of novel reading, for innocent young women reading alone in their closet, being groomed thereby for their own sexual ruination. Art's uncanny ability to produce real, visceral emotions in people who know perfectly well that the precipitating event is not real is aptly summed up in this anecdote from transatlantic literary history. In 1841, an anxious crowd of art consumers converged on the wharf at which the ship was docking. This ship carried the last installment of Charles Dickens' serial novel, The Old Curiosity Shop. Voices shouting, "Is little Nell dead?" had their worst fear confirmed by a passenger at the rail. Yes, little Nell had indeed died. And as the answer rippled through the crowd, people wept unabashedly. Here on the right side, you see little Nell in her deathbed. Academic research centered around such phenomena has been ongoing since the arts were admitted to the university. And in this presentation, we as artist and art professor and fledgling haikuist and literature professor are proposing that the adoption of an enactive view of cognition provides a model for research focused on the mind-body response to interactions with any and every modality of the objects, texts, and activities we call art. Further, we contend that not only arts research, but also arts production creates and interrogates the interrelational knowledge production that the model of an active, embodied, mind-body cognition proposes as an essential to these processes. Arts research and the enactive view. The computational theory of mind, still common in academic research, doesn't account for or recognize the kinds of knowledge produced through the arts. The arts, if they're factored in at all, usually play a marginalized role, often utilized at the end of a study to assist in making new knowledge created in other fields more accessible to a broader audience. Though research in the arts has been embraced in some parts of the world, in U.S. universities, the arts are not seen as a form of knowledge, a form of research, perhaps because the methods, outcomes, and impacts don't fit into this dominant scientific model, the computational model, of how we come to know things. Philosopher Mark L. Johnson provides a convincing counter model in his 2011 essay, Embodied Knowing Through Art, in the Routledge Companion to Research in the Arts. In it, he writes, "Arts research is not geared toward the accumulation of empirical facts or propositional knowledge, although that might be part of the story. Instead, arts research is inquiry into how to experience and transform the unifying qualities of a given experience in search of deepened meaning, enhanced freedom, and increase of connections and relations. But occasionally something truly imaginative and transformative happens, and then we can experience new dimensions, new depths of meaning, new possibilities for significant engagement with our world." It is consummations of this sort at which art research most spectacularly aims. Philosopher Alva Noah, in his 2015 book, Strange Tools, Art and Human Nature, argues that art is a form of research into what we are and what we do as humans. In his view, art works by revealing to us how we as organisms are organized by our habits of thinking and acting. Art is a strange tool which enables us to disorganize and undo ourselves, and in turn provides opportunity for our reorganization. These ideas have been developing across disciplines over 40 years. In 1987, Mark L. Johnson, who we quoted earlier, published the book The Body in the Mind, The Bodily Basis of Meaning, Imagination, and Reason. Later, in 1999, he teamed up with neurolinguist George Lakoff to write Philosophy in the Flesh, The Embodied Mind and Its Challenge to Western Thought. In this latter book, the authors surveyed empirical evidence for the bodily basis of meaning and concepts and began to explore some of the emerging neuroscience evidence for this embodied cognition view. In 1991, Chilean neuroscientist Francisco Varela, psychologist Eleanor Roche, and philosopher Evan Thompson published The Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science and Human Experience. The first edition was 1991, and then you see on the right a recent revised edition. This perspective, referred to as the Enactive View, sees the mind as embodied and embedded in the dynamic interactions of sensing, moving, living organisms and their environment. It's interesting to look at the different covers, one so much focusing on the mind-brain and the other one on the living world, the non-human living world. This idea that cognition is distributed throughout the body is central to Eastern philosophy and indigenous knowledge, and is increasingly supported by recent neuroscientific studies that indicate that the bi-directional interactions between brain and the rest of the body may be necessary for any conscious experience to arise. In the 2020 book, Mind Ecologies, Body, Brain, and World, philosopher Matthew Crippen and behavioral neuroscientist Jay Shuklin corroborate the Enactive View, arguing that cognition, emotion, and perception are incomplete without action, and in action they fuse together. They write, not only are we embedded subjects whose thoughts, emotions, and capacities comprise one integrated system, we are living ecologies inseparable from our surroundings, our cultures, and our world. Teaching the arts as enactive meaning-making processes. The Enactive View of cognition explains our decades of experience teaching and practicing in the arts. It also provides a framework for better understanding visual and literary art as implicating, involving, and changing our mind bodies, and thus our view of the world as well as our potential activities within it. In refutation of the all too prevalent political and even academic view of creation and consumption of art as boutique luxuries, our intervention in academic and political discourse about the arts insists that art matters in an enactive, embodied, embedded, and socially engaged way. In literature, close reading is a process of pulling apart exactly what kind of an active conjoining has happened between the text and the reader, by tying it to the specific brushstrokes, as it were, of the art text. We have been changed, however temporarily, by. As Jacques Derrida has taught us, each text carries within it particular strands of meaning and also strands of undoing that meaning. These strands appear in each text, in each reading of each text, and in a particular and characteristic constellation or pattern. Close reading, which we take to include not only cognitive encounters with the text, but also whole body, mind encounters, like the ones we began the paper with, identifies these constellations by inscribing the specificities of these encounters, thus producing an embodied interlocution between text and reader. Take, for example, a well-known poem written by one of the great four of the Japanese classic haiku tradition, Kobayashi Isa. This dewdrop world is a dewdrop world, and yet. So, here is a poem, and here you are. So far, we are one, the poem is the other. So, we know this collection of words is a poem. It doesn't go to the edges of the pages. It has repetitions where ordinary discursive language wouldn't put them. 11 words, and 2 of them are dewdrop, 2 of them are world, 2 of them are yet, and 2 of them are and. This is not ordinary reality, not discursive language. And it doesn't really offer information per se about dew itself. The question we might ask about experiencing this haiku is, the questions we might ask, what makes our body-mind react? How does it touch us, get to us? How does it make us have visceral responses as we hear or read it? Where am I? Where are ourselves when we read or hear it? Who are we when we are with this poem? The word dewdrop is not in the service of passing along useful information. It is not a weather report or a precipitation assessment. The poem isn't telling us anything about dew. It's doing something to us, using a word that has definitions, synonyms, connotations, and refers to an actual object, a material object in the real world. What the word is doing to us is, in the first instance, provoking a feeling, a mind-body, visceral, physiological event, an event not caused by anything real in the usual daily life sense. We read or hear the words that are arranged on the page, or read to or by us, in a way that marks it as different from prose, excerpted from a Wikipedia entry bearing information about dew. In our regular daily non-poetic lives, we know what dew is. It's a sheet of wetness. It comes and goes beyond our control. If you look closely enough at it, it looks like teardrops. It's temporary. A dewdrop is one tiny component of dew. You can't have dew without dewdrops. You can't have dewdrops if it isn't merged into the dew. We have studied some of these teachings. If you have studied some of these teachings, listened to some of the many Dharma talks online, read this or that book, we know other things about dew and dewdrops. None of that information is on the page. We bring it along from our dailiness to our meeting with the page, or the sounds of being read to. There is no I in the poem, or you either, yet we probably feel addressed, invited by a speaker who we don't really need to identify. And we probably feel a mind-body response as though we personally were being asked to share an experience that isn't made explicit. No story is being told in it, yet one is made, however, in the space between us and the words. A new text arises, which combines the space of the source of the words, of the human being whose cry this is, with our own particular space in our everyday reality, in the now we occupy. We do all this at the behest of the poem, in an interlocutory relationship with it. Whether we notice these details or not, there's some kind of mind-body merging and emerging going on here. Poem and reader meet and mix somewhere in the space in between, and yet each remains. The studio art parallel to the close reading may be the critique, which is also a process of pulling apart a work of art to reveal the meaning it might carry for the maker and the receiver. Alan D'Souza, in his book How Art Can Be Thought, writes about the critique as a bodily encounter one that is sensory, spatial, and experienced. He goes on to say that critique is a participatory event and an adaptive system that requires participation in order to be adaptive and critical. The most striking moments in critique occur when knowledge embedded in the artwork is uncovered in conversation to reveal the previously inaccessible embodied knowledge of the maker, not as a static truth, but as a knowing that emerges out of the complex and dynamic relationships between creator, created, and consumer. Critique provides the opportunity for participants to work together to enact the work, and in the process see themselves and each other differently in ways that last beyond the critique experience. Outside of the classroom, in the real world, Jonathan Keats, who refers to himself as an experimental philosopher, manifests his thought experiments as works of art. One of his dozens of ongoing projects, Deep Time Photography, provides the means for us to extend our mind-body environment in time and space. He has designed two versions of a simple pinhole camera, a century camera, which takes one exposure over 100 years, and a millennium camera, which takes one exposure over 1,000 years. This is what the millennium camera looks like, and a simulation or an idea of what the image may look like when the lens is open for 100 years and recording the change during that time. In this picture, here are two cameras. One is mounted at Lake Tahoe and the other in San Francisco. In an interview in Slate magazine, Keats says, "These cameras are my attempt to compress time, expanding our awareness of change. Hundreds of century cameras have been mounted by citizen artists who have participated in Keats's camera-making workshops all over the world, where they are quietly documenting change over time in their view sheds." Keats is interested in the fact that people who made and hid the cameras will need to reveal the camera's whereabouts to children, who will be the ones to retrieve the cameras and the images after the maker is long gone. This second generation of participants will then reenact in their minds how the photo came to be, working backwards from the place as they see it now. In an email exchange about arts research with one of the co-authors, Ellen McMahon, in March 2023, Keats describes arts research through an enactive lens when he writes, "Conventional research methods are designed to study experimentally or theoretically enclosed environments from the outside. Arts research is an environment, an entanglement of actions, actors, and apparatus." In conclusion, the idea that mind-body response happens whether you are aware of it or not, and that teasing out the process is a way of understanding what happens to us when we experience and then track the full array of our embodied response to the art object. Enabling this kind of knowing and knowledge is precisely why making and teaching art matters, and how arts research helps us to understand the full range of the complexity of human cognition. We are not bodies topped by calculators. We are embodied knowers and enactive creators. In a 2014 interview, cognitive linguist George Lakoff asserts that people who study the human mind estimate that 98% of our thinking is unconscious. We contend that what this means is that a majority of our thinking cannot be accounted for by the computational model of cognition. Does academic research as usual take this into account? We are in trouble as a species, and we are trouble to the rest of the planet. We believe arts research is essential and critical to understanding and operating in the mysterious and neglected 98% of our cognitive field. When arts research is integrated into our ways of knowing ourselves, each other, and our world, we have more access and better understanding of the vast majority of our thinking which is driving our behavior. We like to think of ourselves as the rational animal, but we live, know, and think with our entire mind bodies. We need to employ all of the forms of thinking and knowing to find our way to a better future. We argue that coupling the enactive view of cognition with the methods of art research is a good place to start. Thank you.